Well, good snowy day, everyone. We're here in the warm and cozy pastor cave. When I say we, I mean me, and you might just be able to see Esther, our gray kitty, right behind me there. Anyways, we had 8 or 10 inches of snow last night. So my first duty this morning was to get the snowblower out and get the driveway ready for Karen to be able to pull out and go to work. But today, what I want to do is I want to kind of make a little pause. We're kind of finished, or I'm kind of finished with what I wanted to do with chapter 2. We could say a lot more, and we need to move on to chapter 3. But there's a couple things that I want to talk about. I think it's going to take 2 video segments to do it. One of them is I want to talk about God's provision. Because sometimes there's confusion with God's provision. If you remember the story, or you're hearing the story for the first time, the Israelites, the family of Abraham, was in the area of Canaan, the area of Palestine, during a famine that was, that covered pretty much that whole region of the world. And God made provision for them through one of the sons, Joseph. It's a very long and detailed story. But because of Joseph, God made provision for them to be able to leave Canaan and to go down to Goshen, which is an area, a region inside of Egypt, and to be able to continue to eat there. They were provisioned by Joseph and by the Egyptians during the famine so that they could survive that famine. And so a couple of things there. Number one is to remember that these people are herdsmen. It kind of puts them on the bottom rung, even all the way back then, and because they are herdsmen, you could consider them somewhere between nomadic and semi-nomadic. They had kind of a small range, a small area in which they moved their flocks here and there within Canaan. And then they go down to Goshen, and Goshen is a land that is much more fertile than the land that they had been living in. And you can kind of imagine that, first of all, they probably did, they actually stopped and stayed there, which there's a lot of advantages to living in one place rather than being nomadic or semi-nomadic. So they stopped, they stayed there. They were able to grow crops for the first time, so they kind of moved from herdsmen into the agricultural field, but of course they kept their herds and their flocks, which probably did much better down there because, number one, they didn't have to move around a lot, which poses certain dangers for flocks and herds. And number two, the grasses were better and things like that. So the sheep and the goats probably got fatter and produced better. So it was a good place for them to be. But we have to remember that it was not God's ultimate will for them to be there. It was not God's ultimate will for them to stay there. It was God's provision. In other words, it was God providing for them for a time, but ultimately God's will was for them to be living in the land of Canaan, where they had come from. Okay? And that's really important, or can be important for our lives, because we have to be able to discern God's provision from what God ultimately wants in our lives. Here's a for instance. We can't find, we really think that God wants us to do a certain thing with our lives, but we can't find a job in that area. So we end up, working at Dollar General. Okay. Well, it doesn't really mean that it's God's ultimate will for me to work at Dollar General for the rest of my life. What it means is that God has provided for me He's making a way of provision for me and from the people that I support, my family, those things, by working at Dollar General. And sometimes we only want to strike the big, strike the big score, the big will. And well, I just noticed that was in the way. Okay, now it's not in the way anymore. We want, I'm only gonna take what God's will is out there for me. But sometimes a job or a certain direction that we go in life is part of God's provision. It's not ultimately what He wants for us, but it allows us to eat and drive a car and pay the electric bill and those kinds of things. But there's a danger there, and that's really what I want to talk about. And the danger is getting stuck in God's provision, because that's really what happened to the Israelites, is that they got stuck in God's provision. There is absolutely no way that it was God's will for them to spend 400 years there. Maybe a generation, maybe 2 generations, okay? But they ended up staying way too long, and it caused trouble. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the next video. But we have to be careful not to get stuck in God's provision, because God's provision can be really nice. I mean, God is just one of those guys who just wants to bless everybody. So all of a sudden, let's just say that I took that job at Dollar General just to provide for my family, and it's like $7.50 an hour or something like that. But all of a sudden, somebody notices that I have potential, and all of a sudden, I find myself in management, and then all of a sudden, I'm doing much better financially, and I've got all these benefits and things like that, and all of a sudden, I'm actually able to provide better for my family than I ever was before, and I'm making more money than I ever did before. That's when and that's very much a problem for Americans, really, and we have to be so careful. If we want to really do what God wants us to do, we have to be careful not to get stuck in God's provision. Because it's still, if it wasn't God's will for me to work at Dollar General for the rest of my life when I started, it's still not God's will for me to work at Dollar General for the rest of my life. Even after I'm doing better and I'm making more money, okay? There is that which we do that is God's provision, and there's that which we do which is God's calling for our lives, what God really wants us to do. So don't confuse God's provision with God's will. We have to create a little bit of discernment there. And another way to put that is don't confuse provision with destination. Don't confuse provision with destination, because sometimes when we get into the place of provision, we start to treat it like it's the ultimate destination, which is kind of what the Israelites did. They got to Goshen, they loved it so much that they didn't want to leave, and that's when really a host of problems started for them afterwards, because it was never God's will for them to stay that long there. Okay? Have a great day. God bless you. We'll see you in the next session.